In Canada, asking for evidence now counts as denialism. The sensational current year -2 claims that unmarked Indigenous child graves have been discovered in British Columbia now seem doubtful, but saying so may soon be a criminal offense. So pointing out government propaganda is going to be a criminal offense. You're not allowed to question dear leader. If you demand proof of a false accusation, you are now the bad guy, because how dare you? There's now been more than 2 years since Canada was convulsed by claims that 250 unmarked graves of Indigenous children have been discovered on the grounds of a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. No actual bodies or human remains were in evidence, just ground-penetrating radar indicating regularly spaced soil dislocations. But you wouldn't have known that from the breathless manner in which the story was reported at the time. A Global News headline announced the discovery of human remains at Kamloops residential school grounds. Another at the Toronto Star declared the remains of 215 children have been found. So once again, it was the media spreading their lies to sensationalize a story. So instead of holding the media accountable for this, let's just make it a crime to question the media when they lie. Now, I was one of the many Canadians who believed the headlines. The racist abuses meted out by Canada's 19th, 20th century era residential school system, which had been created to civilize Indigenous people and strip them of their culture, has been widely discussed for decades. Given this dark history, it wasn't too hard to believe that some of the priests and indoctrinators who ran these schools hadn't just been cruel and negligent, this much we already know, but also committed acts of mass murder against defenseless children. Without waiting for the hard evidence to be sprung from the earth, flags were lowered. July 1st, Canada Day celebrations were canceled. Blackface Hitler took a knee for the cameras, and the whole nation went into an utterly unprecedented collective period of self-flagellation. Yeah, this is probably one of the biggest displays of weakness. Like, I know Canada's enemies are watching this, like doing the Happy Merchant impression. So before summer was over, Blackface Hitler pledged more than $300 million in new funding for Indigenous communities so they could complete the grim task of scouring the earth for child corpses. The Canadian press later called it the story of the year. Well, was it under the fiction category? Because I think it should be. 24 months later, much has changed. During this entire period, not a single unmarked grave, body, or set of remains is known to have been found at Kamloops, nor any other of the First Nations communities that conducted similar ground-penetrating radar surveys. But this doesn't mean that the graves and bodies won't be found at some intermediate point in the future. Yeah, if you look hard enough, you're bound to find someone or something. But given the originally announced radar data would have indicated to Indigenous groups and forensic investigators exactly where any suspected human remains would be lying, the passage of 2 years without the reported unearthing of physical evidence can only be described as strikingly odd development. Well, obviously, the alt-right Nazis showed up at night and dug up all the bodies so to make this problem go away. No other explanation. As I noted in a recent article from British Magazine here at Quillette, this is a subject that many polite Canadians are scared to talk about. Fear seems to be the common factor, yeah. Keep voting for the lesser of two evils, too. And this is what you get. In current year -2, the assumed discovery of those 250 unmarked graves took on the quality of a scared national narrative. Pointing out the holes in the narrative and that have since developed, as I'm doing here, feels like secular sacrilege. Are you low-key admitting that you've been indoctrinated into a cult? Because I think that's the first step towards correcting this, is people being forced to admit that they're in a cult. Yeah, some of them are hopeless, but a few might still be saved. Now, moreover, there's a considerable amount of political capital at stake. And that right there, that's the real reason that they want to make it illegal to question this propaganda. So many politicians' careers are riding on these lies. They can't just have these lies being exposed, can they? During the current year -2 federal election campaign, Blackface Hitler campaigned on a promise to make amends for the murderous horrors inflicted on Indigenous Canadians by his forebears. Well, what the hell did the Cubans ever do to the Indigenous Canadians? Like that, I don't get it. And Indigenous leaders, quite understandably, are happy to take the Führer's money as he did so. The journalists assured their readers, listeners, and viewers that the presumed graves offered further proof that Canada was a genocide state. Well, dude, they call everything genocide nowadays. You can't even take that word seriously anymore. It's hilarious. Thereby sparking all manner of new charitable initiatives, hashtags, and t-shirt campaigns. Empty virtue signaling, just say empty virtue signaling. After all this, few public figures have any incentive to admit that perhaps we might have waited for the facts before setting about a garment rending with such gusto. Maybe if nothing else, maybe stories like this can force people to admit privately that they're a bunch of easily manipulated sheep. Like, at the very least, even if you're too embarrassed to admit it publicly, you need to stew in private about how fucking gullible you are and how you just swallow everything the dick of the government cooms out into your mouth. Maybe reflect on that a little bit and something good can come of this. Now, only one large Canadian media outlet, the National Post, dared publish a full and frank analysis of how everyone got unmarked grave story wrong. Other outlets have either ignored the story's denouement altogether or have gone further by denouncing revisionism as a symptom of bigotry. So exposing the truth is a symptom of bigotry, yes. Now, at the Star, for instance, an op-ed writer opined that asking authorities to produce physical evidence in regard to the claimed graves is tantamount to a racist rant bordering on genocide denial. So asking for proof of extraordinary claims is, you're an alt-right Nazi. Only Nazis ask for proof. Yet even as they publicly hewed the orthodox line on the unmarked grave story, Canadian reporters and editors are now adding language that signals the growing uncertainty about what actually lies beneath the ground. Yeah, I think they're afraid of lawsuits at this point. Hopefully, they've already lost the full support and trust of the public. So the aforementioned Global News, a large multimedia brand, offers an informative case study in current year -2. Global headline alluded incorrectly to the discovery of human remains in a short story published a year later. It was a finding of unmarked graves. Then last month, on the second anniversary, the editors retreated to more lawyerly formulation, suspected unmarked graves. Elsewhere in its current year reports, Global has referred to potential unmarked graves or plausible unmarked graves. They sure did. They're trying to walk this back. So, like most Canadian media outlets, Global hasn't gone back to correct its earlier reports on the subject. Imagine if people found out the media was lying to them. Oh, they just make excuses for them and continue listening. Let alone offer any kind of candid explanation for why it is doing so. It is also, and so the unmarked grave story now exists as an odd limbo state, having gradually become more dubious with every passing month, but not so dubious that it has been formally debunked. The only reason it's not formally debunked yet, it's because blackface Hitler and the rest of his Reich, it's not politically convenient for them to have this story debunked. So it's not going to happen. So even some foreign media sites have failed to correct the reporting. On May 28th, the New York Lies reporter named Ian Austin told readers that a mass grave containing Indigenous children has been reported in Canada. In fact, not only has no mass grave been found, but no Indigenous community has made such a claim. The leader of the First Nations community, being referenced explicitly, told the media there was no mass grave and disavowed the usage of the term. At least these guys are smart. They're like, no, we're not going to let you use us to virtue signal. It's been 2 years since the Lies ran this claim with no correction forthcoming, nor has the Lies corrected the equally bungled current year -2 follow-up report by the same author. The subheadline, which referred to the discovery of the remains of hundreds of children, no remains have been discovered either then nor now. The desire to protect unmarked graves narrative remains especially strong among Canada's ruling Liberals. Blackface Hitler, whose Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations has taken the rather extraordinary step, for a liberal democracy at least, of instructing reporters not to report heretical facts. Yeah, it's so cute how you still think Canada is a liberal democracy. You literally live in a totalitarian banana republic. Like, you live in a fascist country, and you still pretend like it's a liberal democracy. When a few writers began saying out loud how odd it was that no bodies have yet been discovered. So the minister, one Mark Miller, denounced these Canadians as being part of a pattern of denialism and distortion that has colored the discourse on residential schools in Canada. They are harmful because they attempt to deny survivors and their families the truth. You're literally the ones that keep defending a lie, and you talk about the truth. So Miller's suggestion here is that the truth of the grave's existence should be taken as a matter of faith by those of pure political heart, regardless of what evidence happens to be available. By adding the word denialism, Miller plainly seeks to compare those of impure hearts to Holocaust deniers. And yet, last month, Miller himself felt compelled to hedge awkwardly when twatting on the 2-year anniversary of the unmarked grave story, excoriating those who make sickening attempts to deny history while also referencing the findings of over 200 suspected unmarked graves. The S word betrays Miller's hypocrisy. If acknowledging those 200 plus graves might not actually exist qualifies as some sickening genocide denier, then Miller seems to belong on that list. Yeah. Why don't you just everyone in Canada should refer to him as such? He's a genocide denier. Absolutely. By his own fucking logic. Later on in his thread, Miller seems to suggest the truth of the grave's existence is besides the point anyway, because the very act of discussing the issue remains traumatic for the community survivors and their families. So, hey, you know all the trauma we caused when we spread this lie? Oh, we don't want all that trauma being reignited by telling them it was all a lie, do we? Oh, let's just not even talk about it anymore. That's what's best for the children, right? Let's just not bring it up. Yeah, let's just conveniently stop talking about this once I'm outed as a liar. And so the writers should resist the temptation to dispute the credulous current year -2 consensus, Miller tells us. Instead, he instructs journalists to assume the role of monks tasked with reflection and contemplation of the work that remains to ensure the indigenous peoples heal. No, all of you liars, and especially all the gullible idiots who believed this, you're the one that needs to be doing some reflection and contemplation. Like, wow, I fell hook, line, and sinker for that lie. What can I do to make sure this doesn't happen again? The Miller's sanctimonious demands don't carry the force of law, thankfully, but it isn't hard to imagine that changing. So in a report released Friday, Kimberly Murray, the independent special interlocutor appointed by Blackface Hitler to investigate the issue of unmarked graves, exhorted politicians to give urgent consideration to civil and criminal legal sanctions against residential school denialism. Oh, yep, there, Blackface Hitler about to go full regular Hitler here. It's an idea that's already been promoted by an MP named Leah Gazan. And Canada's Justice Minister David Lametti says he's open to the proposal. They're literally making questioning media and government lies a crime. Or at least they're planning on it. And you still claim you live in a liberal democracy, huh? Like Miller, Murray seems to regard the claims of unmarked graves at Kamloops and elsewhere as morally unfalsifiable. And since they are the survivors' truths, so we made up a story. We led these people into believing that they were the victims of something horrible. And yeah, it was all a lie, but because they believe it happened now, it is the truth. Must be. No other possible explanation. She repeatedly suggests that the mere act of requesting physical evidence is itself evidence of denialism. On this point, Murray approvingly quotes the chief of First Nation in Western Canada, who subtly addresses denialism by stating whether or not unmarked graves are found, there's enough documented oral and archival evidence that say that these burials do or did exist. Where? The community acknowledges that the voices of survivors who have firsthand accounts of what happened in Indian residential schools should be prioritized over anything else. So listen and believe, basically. Just listen and believe. If you ask for proof, you're literally worse than Hitler. Now, the question of what Murray wants banned under the category of denialism isn't clear. Look, that's because the category itself isn't clear. It's going to be literally anything they don't want people talking about. That's what's going to happen. Anything that's inconvenient for them. However, on page 104 of her report, she references statements such as those contained in this article that scrutinize specific claims being made about suspected graves on specific Indigenous reserves, broader statements that cast doubt on the existence of unmarked graves at any residential school, and even more generalized statements which serve to defend the Indian residential school system and deny that children suffered physical, sexual, psychological, cultural, and spiritual abuses. All of these are described by Murray as detestable utterances, but it isn't clear which, if any, Murray wants to criminalize. All of them, dude. If these Nazis had their way, they would criminalize disagreeing with them on anything. Like, look at what happens when the woke eat each other. They can agree on 99.99%, But then they run into that 0.01% disagreement, and they're literally lifelong enemies now. Any disagreement with the woke cult, they want to criminalize. At other points in the report, Murray goes further, suggesting that the deniers' ranks encompass anyone who does not pledge his or her belief that the residential schools were instruments of literal genocide. Yeah, you guys have watered down the meaning of genocide so much. No one with a brain takes you seriously when you say that. Failing to acknowledge the deliberate genocidal harm inflicted on Indigenous children becomes a barrier to reconciliation and reinforces a culture of denialism in the Canadian population. Look, you want to know what becomes a barrier to reconciliation? When you keep treating people who otherwise would want to reconcile like shit, to the point where they're like, you know what? Maybe I actually don't like you guys now. Now, this would suggest that a person could become a denier without saying or writing anything at all, insofar as they had not heeded Murray's exhortation that each of us must stand up and speak out in the manner she prescribes. Compelled speech, yes. So in the long run, however, this kind of semantic analysis likely won't matter much, since any legal effort to censor denialism, however that word is defined, would almost certainly be struck down by courts as infringement on free speech. You think so? You think the courts are on your side? Canadian constitutional principles permit laws that ban the willful promotion of hatred against identifiable groups. So you already don't have free speech. But no one can seriously argue that asking for evidence of unproven murder allegations or offering dissenting theories about residential schools comes close to meeting that standard. In the past, no one could have seriously believed that quote unquote hate speech would be seen as an exception to free speech either. And look at where we are. You really think that this slippery slope has reached its end? Do you think it can't go further? Because I think you're delusional if you think that way. And yet this isn't a spectacle that Canadians should ignore. The fact that public figures are even taking this kind of censorship proposal seriously speaks to just how desperate they are to avoid a critical re-examination of the country's current year -2 unmarked grave social panic. Blackface Hitler and his ministers must know that the moment of reckoning can't be put off forever. My guess is that they're just hoping they won't be in office when it arrives. Yes, that is 100% the politician mindset. This is what we call kicking the can down the road. They do this on purpose. Like they make decisions that they know are very destructive in the long term, but they make them anyway because it makes them look good in the short term. And in the long term, they're not going to be around to suffer the consequences anyway. Like that's their plan. They know full well that they are destroying the country in the long term, but they also know that they're going to be like living in the Bahamas by the time it explodes. So they don't care, right? It's going to be someone else's problem. And then every new generation of politician that comes in finds ways to further kick the can down the road to their descendants, I guess, their replacements. Do it all the time. That is basically politics. Look, if being a politician was a college course, this would be Politician 101. If you make a decision that you know is bad, all you got to do is make sure that to delay the consequences until after you're gone. That's it.